Have you ever wondered how ideas that are, well, frankly flawed, manage to stick around for decades? We're diving straight into our explainer today, unpacking a super fascinating framework from Dr. Jose Joel Meguiza-Sicko's book, The Death of Utopia. Specifically, we're zooming in on Chapter 14, which introduces this brilliant concept called the revolutionary corindia, or revolutionary eatery. The source takes a hard look at the Communist Party of the Philippines and its ideological founder, Joma Sison. But instead of just dryly listing dates or battles, the author does something really clever. He deconstructs the actual ideology used to justify decades of conflict, treating it like a recipe that's been served to generations of recruits. And as we'll see, the failures of this particular recipe haven't just led to a bad meal, they've had devastating real-world consequences.
So, the author sets the scene for us in the late 1960s. Picture Joma Sison basically acting as the head chef in this metaphorical kitchen of history. The text tells us he steps up to his followers with this incredibly bold claim. Quote, "Mangaka-sama, I have invented a scientific line for the Filipino Revolution." I mean, think about the sheer arrogance there for a second. This wasn't packaged as an experiment or a political theory that was open to debate. No, it was presented as an absolute scientific certainty. It's like a chef believing their soup recipe is literally a fundamental law of physics. By framing it as infallible science, he's basically telling the diners, hey, you don't need to question the menu. You just need to eat it and obey the instructions.
Which brings us to a brilliant term the author coins for this whole ideological blend, CHOP-SUEY's Sisonism. It's essentially a Franken recipe. See, Sison didn't invent a purely original Filipino ideology. Instead, he just patched it together from these disparate foreign dogmas. It is kind of wild when you really think about it. He took the most rigid, immovable chunks of 19th and 20th century foreign thought. We're talking Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, mashed them all together blindfolded, and somehow expected it to make a perfect local dish. The source makes a great point here. In this CHOP-SUEY, the imported core is frozen solid. It's totally sacred. And everything else? Well, that's just garnish. It's just interchangeable tactical add-ons used to cover up the taste when the main dish fails to deliver that promised revolution.
So, let's deconstruct this recipe and look at those borrowed ingredients.
The source basically asks us to step right into the kitchen and break the ideology down. It starts with two massive imports. First up, Marx's prophecy. Sison borrowed Marx's unyielding belief that history has this fixed, completely inevitable direction toward a classless society. Under this dogma, any suffering, violence, or hardship you go through today, that's justified as a necessary down payment for a perfect future. Then the chef throws in Lenin's vanguard model. This brings in the concept of we think, you obey, relying heavily on democratic centralism. The author stresses this creates a strict kitchen rule where the vanguard party, and by extension the chef, is totally infallible. And honestly, in practice, that's incredibly dangerous. If the recipe tastes awful or the strategy completely falls apart, the rules say it's the fault of the people eating it. It literally forces folks to silence their own common sense to serve a chef who can never, ever be questioned.
And then we get to the third major ingredient, which the source highlights as perhaps the most glaring mismatch of them all, Mao's People's War. Let's look at the conditions. The author compares 1940s China directly against the Philippines from the 1970s onward. Okay, so 1940s China, massive, contiguous landmass, an 85 to 90% rural peasantry, and a collapsing central state dealing with a civil war. But the Philippines? It's an archipelago. We are talking about over 7,000 islands, where water naturally cuts off any guerrilla corridors. Add to that a rapidly urbanizing population moving to the cities and a state capacity that was actually getting stronger. You really have to step back and just marvel at the absurdity of this copy-paste job. I mean, how exactly do you march a peasant army across an ocean? The source argues that this Maoist ingredient was literally spoiled from day one. It was a strategy forcefully jammed into a country with totally incompatible geographic and social conditions.
All right, moving on to the spices, or what we'll call the tactical add-ons.
So what exactly happens when this mismatched imported stew inevitably fails to produce the promised utopia? Well, according to the source, the chef doesn't admit defeat or tweak the base recipe. Nope, they just start tossing in completely random tactical spices. The text uses a local phrase for this, kung anong uso is sahog natin, which basically means whatever is trending, just throw it in the pot. It's this rapid-fire series of shifting tactics deployed over the decades. When the rural war stalls, they deploy SPARU or Sparrow units, urban hitmen. Then they bounce from boycotting elections to suddenly, out of nowhere, participating in them. When the internal paranoia kicks in, they launch rectification movements, which, let's be real, is just a sanitized brand name for brutal internal purges. They use international NGOs and front organizations to launder their narratives, and they engage in peace talks on this endless loop, treating them as a quick breather rather than an actual off-ramp. The sheer chaos of it is almost hard to believe, but the author argues these aren't some grand, masterful strategies. They're desperate cover-ups, deployed just to hide the fact that the underlying ideological soup is fundamentally broken.
This brings us to the real human cost. The source calls this next part the moral scam, a stew with a body count.
The author is crystal clear here. We are not just critiquing some abstract academic theory. This recipe demanded real human lives. As the source material reflects, the reality on the ground was absolutely devastating. A massive chunk of the book is dedicated to explaining how this ideology trapped its own followers in a system of absolute suffocating fear. In the underground, asking a single question or showing even a tiny hint of doubt, that wasn't just frowned upon, it was treated as outright treason. The paranoia of a movement turning on itself is truly terrifying. The text recounts how this total ideological rigidity led to horrific internal purges, where the organization literally executed its own members, silencing any dissent just to protect the illusion that the core ideology was still perfect.
The author labels the very center of this stew the moral scam. It operates as this deeply insidious psychological trap functioning in an inescapable four-step loop. Let's walk through it. Step 1. The leaders claim the ideological line is scientific and inevitable. Step 2. Because it's quote-unquote science, they command total obedience without question. Step 3 is the cost. If people die along the way, well, it's rationalized away as a necessary sacrifice for the future utopia. And then Step 4. This is perhaps the most brilliant and dangerous part, the escape hatch. If the prophecy fails, and the author argues it has continually failed for half a century, the ideology never, ever blames itself. Instead, it shifts the blame entirely. It's always internal deviation, or betrayal by spies or state sabotage. It is a perfectly sealed system designed to guarantee its own survival at the expense of its followers. And you know, we see closed-loop logic exactly like this today in extreme online echo chambers or modern cults. The belief system is never wrong, only you are wrong for questioning it.
Which leads us to the climax of the book and one truly fatal question.
To wrap up this explainer, the author brings in the philosophy of Karl Popper. Now, Popper famously warned that any ideology that cannot admit error will eventually demand blood to protect itself. Using that lens, the author introduces a single terrifying question that threatens to just completely destroy this entire closed ideological system. And the question is this: what if the theory is wrong and we killed people for nothing? The source argues that CHOP-SUEY simply cannot afford to ever ask, let alone answer that question. Because the moment a follower realizes that the revolution isn't historically inevitable and that the theory might just be a flawed patchwork of imported ideas, the entire moral license to commit violence instantly collapses. It leaves us with a really profound provocation. It challenges us to look at any system, any organization, or ideology in our own world that demands absolute obedience and refuses to admit fault. Because as the source material powerfully reminds us, the refusal to accept error is always the very first ingredient in a recipe for disaster. Think about that.